On the evening of November 16, 2013, 57-year-old Nancy Pfister stood in front of a crowded room of party guests inside of her house in Aspen, Colorado. Nancy held up a bottle of expensive champagne and called out to get everyone's attention. Her guests turned and watched their host like she was a queen holding court. Nancy had blonde hair and blue eyes and looked like she could have been a model. She told the crowd that she was going to skip winter in the mountains of Colorado and head to the warm beaches of Australia, and she could not think of a better way to spend her last night in town than hanging out with all the people she loved. Nancy thanked everyone for coming, popped open the champagne, and told her guests to have fun. Music began to play, and the guests cheered, and then they all kind of began circulating through Nancy's massive house that sat on over 35 acres of land. And they could look out through these huge floor-to-ceiling windows to get an incredible view of Nancy's property that was covered in aspen trees and surrounded by the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. A lot of Nancy's friends were some of the wealthiest people in Aspen, which was known as one of the wealthiest cities in America, so this was saying something. But the view from Nancy's house was so spectacular, it still made all of her friends a bit jealous. Nancy poured herself a glass of champagne, took a sip, and looked out at everyone with a huge grin on her face. Hosting parties was one of her favorite things to do. In fact, over the decades, Nancy's parties had become sort of legendary. Nancy had inherited millions of dollars and part of the successful ski resort her parents had owned. So Nancy had always had money, and she had always played hostess to the rich and famous who vacationed in Aspen. She had also been briefly engaged to the actor Michael Douglas, she was still good friends with the very famous actor Jack Nicholson, and she'd even hung out with the Dalai Lama. She was also known to have regularly gotten drunk with Hunter S. Thompson, the very famous author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, who had unfortunately taken his own life, actually not far from Aspen, back in 2005. Nancy walked through the large open front room of her house and began to mingle with some of her guests. But she had her eye on a particular couple that was sitting on the couch. Nancy waved to them, and their faces lit up. Dr. Trey Styler and his wife were in their 60s, but Trey had been dealing with some pretty serious health issues, so he actually looked 10 years older than he was. He often had trouble standing, and walking for long periods of time was a big challenge, but he still had a sharp mind and an amazing sense of humor, which is actually why Nancy liked him so much. She thought he was really funny. Nancy walked over to Trey and his wife, who also happened to be named Nancy, and she sat down next to them on the couch, and then she asked them how they were enjoying the party. They said they were having a great time, but admittedly, they were already plotting how to clean up the house afterwards, and Nancy smiled and laughed. When Nancy had made her plans to travel to Australia, the Stylers had been looking for a new home in the area, and when Nancy found out about it, she suggested they put that off and just rent her place while she was gone. And she actually said they could just move in right away if they wanted to. That way the house would feel more like a home when they were actually on their own. The Stylers had jumped at the chance. They loved Nancy's house, like everybody did, and they always had a great time with Nancy. So the three of them had basically been roommates for the last several weeks, and as much as Nancy was looking forward to traveling in Australia, she was going to miss spending time with the Stylers. And Trey and his wife felt the same way. Trey had been a very successful anesthesiologist before his health forced him to retire. But, like Nancy, he had inherited a lot of money, so the two of them shared similar backgrounds and seemed to really connect with each other. Nancy was still talking to the Stylers when she heard someone calling her name. She glanced up and saw her friend, Kathy Carpenter, was standing there, looking totally panicked. Kathy told Nancy that she really needed to talk to her right now. Nancy told Trey and his wife she'd catch up with them later, and then she stood up and walked with Kathy to a secluded corner of the room. Other guests watched as Nancy and Kathy huddled together and began to talk. It was something they were all used to seeing, but most of them didn't understand why Nancy even bothered with Kathy. Nancy and the majority of her friends were part of a group that others called Aspen Royalty. Basically, they were people who seemed to have enough money to do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And a lot of them were self-proclaimed snobs who wanted nothing to do with people outside of their own social class. But Nancy was different. She made friends everywhere she went and didn't care if people had money or not. Kathy was a bank teller in town, and every time Nancy had gone to the bank, she thought Kathy seemed like a very nice person. So one day, Nancy had asked Kathy if she'd like to go to lunch, and Kathy said she'd love to. And the two women hit it off and had become close friends ever since. Now, even though Nancy didn't seem to care about their very different social classes, Kathy couldn't ignore it. And so quickly after becoming friends, Kathy began doing things like picking up Nancy's prescriptions at the pharmacy for her and going to the grocery store to make sure Nancy had her food, and she even helped keep track of how much money Nancy spent, even if Nancy didn't seem to care. And so whether Kathy or Nancy realized this, basically, Kathy had become Nancy's personal assistant, even though obviously Kathy was not getting paid to do this and still had to have her job at the bank to make ends meet. And so back at the party in the corner of the room, Nancy asked Kathy what was so urgent that it couldn't wait until after the party. And Kathy said she was just worried that not everything in Nancy's life had been settled before her Australia trip. And also, Kathy wanted to know if Nancy wanted Kathy to look after her house while she was gone. This was something that Kathy kind of automatically did for Nancy anytime Nancy was out of town. Again, sort of acting like her assistant, even though she wasn't. Nancy was sort of annoyed by this. She didn't feel like talking about this right in the middle of the party, and so she tried to just kind of softly end the conversation with Kathy, but Kathy was persistent and really wanted to know what Nancy needed while she was going to be gone. And so finally, Nancy told Kathy that yes, it would be great if you stopped by the house once in a while and made sure her dog was okay. And also, if Trey and his wife, who were going to be staying at Nancy's house, needed anything, well, it would be great if Kathy could help them with that too. And so Kathy nodded, understanding her assignments, and then Nancy took a swig of her champagne, flashed a smile, and then rejoined the party and left Kathy standing all alone in the corner. Three months later, on the morning of February 22nd, 2014, Kathy opened up Nancy's front door with her own key. She walked into the front room, and she found Dr. Trey Styler and his wife waiting for her. Trey sat in a wheelchair with a couple of suitcases at his side, and Nancy's dog was laying at his feet. Over the past few months, Trey's health problems had only gotten worse, and he was really struggling to walk a lot of the time. Kathy looked frazzled, like she often did, and she asked the Stylers if they had everything and if they were ready to go. A few days earlier, Nancy had emailed Kathy to say she was coming home from Australia. When Nancy had left, she actually had not set a return date, at least not officially, but now this email served as letting people know she was coming back home. And so Kathy wanted to make sure everything in the house was perfect for Nancy when she got home, and that meant making sure Nancy had the house to herself. So Kathy had informed the Stylers that they needed to get out of the house and take all their belongings with them so she could straighten up before Nancy got there. In the front room, Trey leaned down, grabbed one of the suitcases, and put it on his lap. Trey's wife grabbed the other suitcase and told Kathy they were ready to go. But she said they were leaving a few things behind that they would want to come back to get. Kathy suddenly was panicked and said they really needed to make sure everything was out of the house. But in a calm, steady voice, Trey told her that everything was fine. He reminded Kathy that they had been paying rent on the house. They were not just guests here. They didn't want to cause any problems, but they were sure Nancy would be okay with having some of their things still in the house just for a few more days. Then Trey pushed himself through the room towards the front door, and his wife and Kathy followed. They made it outside, and right away Trey began to shiver. The sun was shining, but there was snow on the ground, and it was only about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, so right below freezing. Trey had also lost quite a bit of weight recently, which contributed to him feeling cold. His wife helped him into Kathy's car and then put his wheelchair and their suitcases in the trunk. Then Kathy hopped in the driver's seat and drove the couple a few miles away to the hotel where they were going to stay until their new house was ready. And then after dropping the couple off, Kathy headed back to Nancy's. That evening, Kathy drove to the airport with Nancy's dog in the back seat. She knew Nancy would be thrilled to see him as soon as she landed. A little later, after flying for almost 24 hours and experiencing a massive 16-hour time change, Nancy finally stepped off the plane in Colorado. She somehow felt exhausted, but also completely wired, and she really had no idea what day it was. Kathy met Nancy at the baggage claim and helped her get everything over to the car. Nancy climbed into the back seat, and her dog jumped on her and licked her face. Nancy was glad to be back. When they got back to Nancy's house that evening, even though Nancy was dealing with major jet lag and felt totally exhausted, no matter what she tried, she couldn't fall asleep. So Kathy just stayed with her that night to make sure she really was okay and that if she needed anything, she would go get it. And then for the next 36 hours, Nancy just really couldn't quite fall asleep, and so she was just totally exhausted and miserable. But then finally, on the morning of February 24th, so a day and a half after Nancy got home, she just totally crashed. Kathy stayed in the bedroom with Nancy for a bit, but when it was clear Nancy really had fallen asleep and was not going to wake up anytime soon, Kathy went down to the kitchen, and she made sure Nancy's dog had plenty of food and water, and then she found a piece of paper and a marker, and she made a do not disturb sign. Kathy knew that secretly, Nancy hated being woken up before she was ready, and so she did not want anybody to disturb Nancy. And so Kathy walked outside, and she taped the sign to the front door. Then she got into her own car and drove back to her own apartment. On the morning of February 26th, so 2 days after Kathy left Nancy's house when Nancy had finally fallen asleep, Trey and his wife came back to Nancy's house to get the rest of their stuff. They saw the Do Not Disturb sign that was on the door, and they assumed Nancy had to be sleeping, but they still wanted to get their things, and they also really wanted to talk with Nancy to make sure everything was okay with the house. So Trey's wife used her key and they opened the door, and the second they went inside, they were hit with this horrible smell. Trey covered his mouth and nose and wanted to go back outside, but his wife said she heard something and she rushed to the kitchen. There, she saw Nancy's dog pacing back and forth and squealing. His food and water bowls were empty, and he had used the kitchen floor like a bathroom. Trey's wife looked at the scene completely confused. Nancy could be flighty sometimes and leave town almost on a whim, but she loved her dog and always made sure he was well taken care of anytime she was gone. But Trey's wife told herself, maybe Nancy hadn't heard the dog squealing because she was in a really deep sleep, still worn out from her trip. So she went upstairs, walked down the hall to Nancy's bedroom, opened the door, and went inside, and when she did, she felt even more confused about the whole situation. Because Nancy wasn't in there, and it looked like her bed had been totally stripped, like Nancy had gone to do a load of laundry and never came back or something. Trey's wife immediately headed right back downstairs and found her husband still waiting by the door, and she told him what she saw. So Trey's wife called Kathy at the bank where she was working and filled her in. When Kathy heard what was going on, she said this all sounded really strange because Nancy had been sleeping when she left the house, and Kathy had made sure the dog had plenty of food and water. So did this mean Nancy hadn't checked on the dog in over 2 days? Trey's wife said she would clean it all up, take the dog out, and make sure he was okay and fed before she left, but she was worried about Nancy. Kathy said she felt the same way. So she hung up and called Nancy, but it went straight to voicemail. So she sent Nancy several text messages and also an email. But by 5:30 p.m., when Kathy got off work, she still hadn't heard anything from Nancy. So she drove straight to Nancy's house. A few minutes later, Kathy arrived at Nancy's. She first checked on the dog and then went upstairs to Nancy's bedroom. And when she went inside, she saw the bed was stripped, just like Trey's wife had said. Kathy walked about 15 feet across Nancy's bedroom to a large walk-in closet. Now, this closet was bigger than a lot of people's bedrooms, and Nancy had actually converted it into a meditation room. She had hung Tibetan prayer flags on the wall and filled it with candles and personal keepsakes. Kathy knew that Nancy did not like anyone going in that closet, but she knew she had to go in because she had to find Nancy. And so Kathy first knocked on the door of this meditation room, but it was silent inside. So she eventually reached down and grabbed the doorknob, but when she turned it, she felt that it was locked, and Nancy's key to the closet was nowhere to be found. So Kathy ultimately walked back downstairs, went outside, got in her car, and sped back to her apartment, and there she grabbed her duplicate key to Nancy's walk-in closet that Kathy kept on its own keychain, and then with the key in hand, she drove back to Nancy's house. At about 5:45 p.m., Kathy walked into Nancy's bedroom again, and this time she saw something she'd overlooked. There was a small splash of blood on the headboard of the bed, and when she saw this, Kathy began to shake. Then Kathy slowly turned towards the meditation room, the walk-in closet, and she began walking in that direction. And when she got there with shaking hands, she used her key and opened the door. And when she looked inside, at first, it looked like the way it always did, with all the different keepsakes and the flags and the candles. But right as Kathy was about to leave, she noticed something on the ground. And when she looked more closely, she began to scream. Kathy immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911. And when the operator answered, Kathy could barely speak. She was basically hyperventilating. But finally, she did manage to shout that her friend, Nancy Pfister, was dead inside of her closet, and she was sure Nancy had been murdered. Kathy's 911 call took the Pitkin County Sheriff's Department by complete surprise. Crime was rare in Aspen, Colorado, and there hadn't been a murder in town in over a decade. And on top of that, almost everybody in the area knew who Nancy Pfister was. She was basically a celebrity in Aspen. If Nancy really had been murdered, the county police knew this would be their highest profile case in a very long time. So they immediately reached out to the state police and the district attorney's office for help. And not long after that, an investigator with the DA's office named Lisa Miller parked her car in the long driveway in front of Nancy's house and stepped outside. Investigator Miller was tall with light brown hair, and she was wearing a gray wool overcoat and dark sunglasses. Miller had a reputation for being a staunch advocate for victims and for being very straightforward when dealing with suspects. From where she was standing, Miller looked around and saw all the huge aspen trees spreading out across Nancy's huge property, and she was also able to look inside of Nancy's house through her large front windows, and it was beautiful inside. And so Miller thought, this is like one of the most beautiful places she'd ever seen if it wasn't for the fact that county police officers were stretching crime scene tape all across the yard. Miller saw a couple of deputies talking with Kathy a few feet from Nancy's front door, and she also saw Sheriff Joey DeSalvo standing nearby with Nancy's dog. Miller waved to DeSalvo and walked over to him. She asked him if he had seen the body yet, but DeSalvo just shook his head, and Miller could tell he was on the verge of tears. DeSalvo said Nancy was a good friend of his. Before he was sheriff, he'd had a bit of a wild side, and actually he and Nancy used to party together. And he also said that he was the one who'd been called in to deal with Hunter S. Thompson's body after the writer had killed himself, and seeing someone he knew covered in blood like that had haunted DeSalvo for years, so he couldn't bring himself to go look at Nancy's body. Miller said she understood and just told him that he would need to tell her everything he knew. DeSalvo nodded and said that Kathy, the friend of Nancy's who had found the body and called 911, had told him that when she went into the bedroom closet, she had found her friend's body on the floor. Nancy's body was wrapped up in some sheets and a carpet, and her hair was matted with blood. That's about all he knew as far as the body was concerned. But there was one more thing that Kathy had told him. Kathy said that she had noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing from her bathroom. Miller thanked DeSalvo, slipped on a pair of gloves, and then walked inside the house with one of the sheriff's deputies. Miller and the deputy headed upstairs and walked directly into Nancy's bedroom. They noticed the bed was stripped, and they saw blood on the headboard. Then they stepped into the closet that had been turned into a meditation room and looked down at the floor. But for a second, they both just stood there confused, because it just looked like there was a blanket and a pile of sheets laying there. And so Miller crouched down, and it wasn't until she was right over the blanket and sheets that she could tell they were actually wrapped around something. Miller kept staring at the pile for a second, and then she asked the deputy if Kathy had mentioned moving the blanket or touching it in some way. But the deputy said, according to Kathy, she had not touched anything in the closet. This made no sense to Miller, because at this moment, it was really impossible to tell if what was wrapped up inside of these sheets and this carpet was actually Nancy Pfister's body. And Miller definitely couldn't see any blonde hair matted with blood nearby like Kathy claimed to have seen inside of this closet. Miller nodded to the deputy, and so he crouched down, and together, they began to unwrap the blanket and the sheets. And as they did, they heard a strange sound, like the sheets were rubbing against something plastic. And then finally, once they had unspooled the bedding, they tossed it aside, and what they were left with was blood-stained trash bags wrapped around a dead body. Miller began to remove the trash bag covering the victim's head, and this is when she saw blonde hair matted with blood, just like Kathy had said. Miller finally pulled the trash bag all the way away, revealing the victim's face, and immediately the deputy lowered his head and told Miller that that was definitely Nancy Pfister. Miller wanted to wait for the state forensics team to arrive before handling the body anymore, so she and the deputy stepped out of the closet and began to search the rest of the house. But during the search, Miller didn't find any signs of forced entry or of a robbery. I mean, expensive paintings still hung on the wall, and Nancy's electronics and computer were plainly visible but looked untouched. And so Miller headed back outside into the cold winter air, and she saw Kathy, so she walked over to her and introduced herself, and she told Kathy they would need to talk at length at some point. But for now, Miller said she only had one question. Had Kathy touched the blanket or the sheets on the floor inside of that closet? Kathy shook her head and said no. She said she really had not touched anything in the closet, and as soon as she saw her friend's body on the floor, she called 911. And so Miller thanked her and went back inside of Nancy's house. Not long after Miller's initial sweep of the house, state forensics officers arrived on the scene. They followed Miller to Nancy's bedroom and began searching for prints, and they also took a sample from the blood spatter on the headboard. Then they flipped over the mattress and found several large bloodstains on it. After that, the officers went into the closet and began to do a thorough search of the body. All the while, Miller kept looking back and forth between the closet and the bed. The bloodstains on the headboard and the mattress made it seem like Nancy had been attacked in bed and then dragged, 15 feet or so across the room to the closet. The killer had also flipped the mattress over to try to hide the bloodstains and then clearly wrapped the body up in bedding and trash bags. And this was not an easy task. Just moving Nancy's body around would have been heavy and cumbersome, and there were so many steps the killer had to complete before leaving the house. And so as a result, Miller knew the killer would have needed a lot of time after killing Nancy, and also a lot of strength to pull this off. Or the killer would have needed a partner. And so Miller thanked the forensics officers and headed back downstairs, and she was still taking in everything she'd seen and heard, but at this point, she was sure about one thing. Kathy had lied to the police, because Nancy's body was not visible inside of the closet. And so if Kathy said she had seen her friend's blonde hair matted with blood, that meant either she did move the blankets and the carpet, and that's how she saw it, and then covered it back up, or Kathy just knew Nancy's hair was matted with blood because Kathy had killed her or had assisted in killing her. Investigator Miller knew that the murder of a wealthy socialite would send shockwaves through Aspen, and it would quickly lead to gossip and panic among locals and vacationers, so she didn't waste any time. Not long after Miller searched Nancy's house, she told Kathy to come down to the sheriff's station to meet with her and county and state police investigators. That day, Kathy stepped into the small interview room at the station. Kathy was average height with long brown hair, and she wore jeans and a red sweatshirt. And she looked very upset from the moment she sat down directly across from Miller. Miller spoke calmly and quietly. She thanked Kathy for coming in and then asked her to walk them through all the details of what happened when she went inside of Nancy's house, all the way through to calling 911. Kathy said when she'd gone to Nancy's the first time, she noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing, and she also noticed the closet door, the meditation room, was locked. And then when she went looking for the key to that closet that she knew Nancy always kept in her bedroom, she found it was gone. And so this was all very strange. And so that's what led Kathy to go back to her place, get her own key to the closet, and rush back to Nancy's house. Then suddenly, Kathy's voice trailed off, and she began wailing and heaving and struggling to breathe. The investigators worried she was hyperventilating, like she had during her 911 call. But despite Kathy's hysterics, Miller noticed something about Kathy that was very strange. Even though Kathy was visibly sobbing, Miller couldn't see any tears. Miller did not like to judge how people grieved, but she had seen suspects act like this before. And they often used these huge displays of emotion to try to cover up their own guilt, or to at least avoid answering questions. Finally, when Kathy calmed down, Miller immediately began asking questions. She asked Kathy again if she had touched the bedding or Nancy's body when she went into the closet. Miller wanted to give Kathy a chance to change the story that she'd told her at the house. But Kathy said she had not touched Nancy. When she was in the closet, she had just looked at the floor, saw her friend's bloody hair, and immediately knew Nancy was dead. At this point, Miller sat up straight in her chair. Her height could make her intimidating, but her demeanor always remained totally calm. Miller thought there was a good chance Kathy was lying, but there was also a chance Kathy had been so upset that she really didn't remember everything that happened. People in shock can forget things, so maybe Kathy had partially uncovered Nancy's body, covered it back up, and then sort of blocked it out of her mind. Another deputy in the room pushed the interview forward and asked Kathy if she resented Nancy for her money. Was she angry that she had to run around doing errands for Nancy while never getting paid a dime for it? But Kathy shook her head. She said it wasn't like that. She and Nancy were extremely close and they loved each other. And something about the way Kathy said that struck Miller as strange. She couldn't be sure, but this woman seemed like more than just a broken-hearted friend. So Miller leaned in and asked Kathy if she and Nancy were actually lovers. Kathy looked very surprised by this question, but she took a deep breath and looked very calm for the first time in the interview, and then she said that she and Nancy had been intimate, but only one time, and that it didn't matter. They were just friends who cared about each other. Kathy insisted that she was not some kind of jealous girlfriend, and that she had nothing to do with Nancy's murder. Miller didn't show any sort of reaction on her face. She had no idea if Kathy was actually telling the truth about being intimate with Nancy only once, but she thought that if it was true, certainly once could have been enough to complicate the relationship. And so after a tense silence, Miller asked if Kathy could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her friend. Kathy sat there silent. An angry look came across her face, and then she nodded. She said she had a pretty good idea of who wanted to kill Nancy. It was Dr. Trey Styler and his wife. After the interview with Kathy, investigator Miller thought that Kathy was either directly involved with the murder or just knew more than she was letting on. Kathy had easy access to Nancy's house and a key to the walk-in closet where Nancy had been found. Kathy also had a sexual relationship with Nancy at least one time, and she seemed to know details about the body that only the killer would know. But all the evidence pointing at Kathy was still circumstantial, so for the time, police let her go home. Soon after Kathy left, county officers located Trey and his wife at the hotel where they were staying, and they asked them to come to the station. When Trey walked into the interview room for his interview, Miller was taken aback by how frail this man looked. He clearly struggled to walk, and he was extremely underweight for his height. This just was not a guy with the physical strength to murder Nancy, then wrap her up, drag her to the closet, and then flip over a mattress. It just was not possible. But Kathy, in her interview, really seemed to think that Trey and his wife were capable of killing Nancy and had wanted to kill Nancy. So Miller began by asking Trey about his relationship with Nancy and his time living alone inside of her house. Trey would admit that Nancy could be very difficult to deal with as a landlord. She was terrible at keeping records and often thought she was owed money that she had already been paid. But Trey had said that working with Kathy and Nancy's attorney had made things a lot easier, so any issues he might have had with renting the house always got worked out. When Trey's wife had her interview, she basically said the same thing as her husband. And even though she was not frail like her husband, investigators did not think this slight woman in her mid-60s could have physically carried out the murder on her own either. So by the time Trey and his wife left the station, investigators still believed that Kathy was the most likely suspect. And Miller thought there were two key pieces of evidence they needed to find to directly link Kathy to the murder. There were Nancy's missing pills and Nancy's missing key to the closet. On February 28, 2014, 2 days after Nancy's body was discovered, a county sanitation worker walked along a street checking the public trash cans. A lot of mountain towns in Colorado have strict rules about what can and can't be deposited in public trash cans in an effort to keep bears away. And so sanitation workers literally check the trash cans to make sure these rules are being followed. And so this worker opened a trash can out in front of some shops, and right away something caught his eye. In an open bag, he saw several pill bottles. This type of personal trash was not going to attract bears, but it was still not allowed in public trash cans. So he leaned in to grab the bag, and when he got closer, he saw the name on the bottles, Nancy Pfister. Like everybody in the area, the worker knew about Nancy's murder, so he immediately contacted the sheriff's department. Investigator Miller got word that the missing pills had been found, and she couldn't believe her luck. It was like a prayer had been answered. Then, the following day, a man was walking down the sidewalk not far from where the pills had been found, and he saw something on the ground, glinting in the sunlight. He bent down and saw it was a key, and there was a tag on the keychain that said Owner's Closet. He picked it up and handed it over to a county police officer who was parked nearby. And back at the sheriff's department, it did not take long for officers to realize that this key was the missing key to Nancy's meditation room. And so investigators started to feel like they must have a guardian angel or something. In the span of 2 days, 2 random people had located key pieces of evidence that helped break the case wide open. Because the locations where the key and the pill bottles had been found made it pretty clear who had gotten rid of them. So, over the next couple of weeks, investigators followed up on the evidence, shored up their case, and then made an arrest. Then, about 3 months later, in June, investigator Miller, along with officers from the county and state police, sat in an interview room and listened to the killer's full confession. Based on that confession, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators were told happened to Nancy Pfister on the night of February 24th, 2014. That night, the killer stood at the bottom of Nancy's stairs inside of her house, holding several trash bags and an electrical cord in one gloved hand and a hammer in the other. They walked up the stairs slowly, trying not to make any noise. Once they reached the second floor, they headed down the hall and walked into Nancy's bedroom. The killer saw Nancy asleep in her bed. She had her headphones in, and she was wearing an eye mask to block out any light. This put the killer at ease. It didn't look like Nancy was going to wake up and fight back. So, the killer walked over to the bed and put down the trash bags and the cord, but kept the hammer in their hand. Then they just stood there staring at Nancy as she slept. After taking a breath, the killer slowly raised that hammer up into the air and then smashed it down into Nancy's head. The killer felt Nancy's skull crack, but they immediately raised the hammer again and kept swinging it down at her head and face. As they did, blood splashed against the headboard and ran down into the mattress. Eventually, the killer stopped their frenzied attack and lowered the hammer, and then stared down at Nancy's now dead body. Then they dropped the hammer onto the trash bags, and then took the top blanket off the bed and placed it on the floor, Then the killer quickly pulled the bloody sheets off the bed and threw those on top of Nancy's body, and then they grabbed the corners of the blanket and began to drag the blanket with Nancy on top of it over to the walk-in closet. When they reached the closet, the killer noticed Nancy's key was sticking out of the lock on the closet door. So they dropped the blanket, used the key to open the door, and then dragged Nancy inside the closet. Then they ran back into the bedroom, grabbed the trash bags, and went back into the closet. There, the killer crouched down and wrapped Nancy's head in one of the bags. They cinched it tight around her neck using the electrical cord, then they also wrapped up her torso and her legs with the other trash bags. Once they were satisfied, the killer also wrapped Nancy in her own bed sheets, as well as her own blanket, and then left her right in the middle of the closet. The killer stood up and looked down at the floor where Nancy was, and to them, it was barely even noticeable that a body was under all those layers. So they stepped out of the closet, closed and locked the door, and pocketed Nancy's key. Then they went back to Nancy's bed and flipped it over so the blood wouldn't show. Then the killer went into the bathroom and took a few pill bottles from the counter. They figured this might make it look like Nancy had just taken off for a few days. Finally, the killer headed downstairs, carrying the hammer and the pills in their hands, and as they exited the house, they could hear the sound of Nancy's dog barking in the kitchen. But they didn't care. They just rushed out to their car, hopped inside, and drove a few miles away to the hotel where they were staying. In the days following Nancy's murder, investigators came to believe that Kathy was involved, because it looked like she had lied, and because she knew details that she could not have seen without handling the body. But then, police received those two key pieces of missing evidence, Nancy's pill bottles and her closet key, and they were both found right near the hotel where Trey and his wife were staying. And when investigators followed up with them, they discovered that Trey and his wife's relationship with Nancy had actually totally fallen apart while Nancy was in Australia. Nancy was not just absent-minded when it came to getting her rent like Trey had suggested. Instead, she was aggressive and kind of a bully. She wanted the Stylers to pay several months' rent, which was over $13,000, in cash all at once. But Trey insisted that was not what they had agreed to, and his medical bills were draining his savings, so paying that all at once really was not an option. Over the course of Nancy's trip, both parties got their attorneys involved and started accusing the others of trying to rip them off. So by the time Nancy finally flew back to Colorado, Trey and his wife had made it clear they were very, very angry at her. In fact, they had told Kathy on several occasions that they wished Nancy was dead. And it would turn out Kathy had basically said the same thing to the Stylers. She also seemed fed up with Nancy, specifically the demands Nancy kept putting on her. And she said there was a dark and cruel side to Nancy that really only people close to her saw. Her public perception is she was not this snobby, awful person, but, behind closed doors, at least to Kathy and to the Stylers, she was. When investigators learned all of this, they no longer believed Trey and his wife were innocent, but they also didn't believe that this couple was physically capable of committing this murder without help. So investigators became convinced that the Stylers and Kathy had killed Nancy together. And in March of 2014, police arrested Trey, his wife, and Kathy. But then in June, when all three suspects were behind bars, investigator Miller sat and listened to a full confession, but that confession only came from Trey. He claimed he had planned and carried out the murder all by himself. His wife and Kathy had nothing to do with it. In fact, Trey explained that he'd experienced this insane jolt of adrenaline on the night of the murder, something he had never felt before, that made it feel like he had no health problems. And so he said that was how he was able to kill Nancy with a hammer, drag her body to the closet, and wrap her up in blankets, sheets, and trash bags. And so based on Trey's confession, his wife and Kathy were eventually released from jail. Trey was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison, but in 2015, he hanged himself in his cell. After Trey's death, his wife received a $1 million life insurance payout, and she would go on to write a book about Nancy Pfister's murder. To this day, some people involved in this investigation do not believe Trey Styler acted alone, that basically he confessed in order to protect Kathy and his wife.
In 1987, 21-year-old Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband, and she was living with her two friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful, but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her two friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory, and so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur, and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over, she was so tired. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last two pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna. Because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life.
Our next story is called Psychopath.
In 2008, 28-year-old Chris Smith was an up-and-coming star in the lead generation business. Lead generation is not a flashy business. Basically, you create these ads that are designed to generically help people with things like lowering their mortgage payments or reducing their credit card debt. And in these ads, you leave behind a 1-800 number for anybody interested to call. And the people that do call, their information is taken down, and then the lead generator, the person who made that ad, they sell that information to mortgage brokers and debt consolidators and anybody else that wants access to that lead. Chris's ability to create these really compelling ads and get people to call said number was so good that it caught the attention of another up-and-comer in the lead generation space, a man by the name of Ed Shin. Ed worked for a lead generation company called LG Tech in Southern California, and Ed wound up hiring Chris to come onto their team as a consultant. Right away, Chris and Ed totally hit it off, despite being very different people. Chris was a surfer bro who wore flip-flops and t-shirts every day and never went to college. Ed was a very sharply dressed, college-educated father of three who went to church every Sunday. But where they overlapped was their shared desire to become fabulously wealthy. After working together for a little while at LG Tech and doing quite well for themselves, they realized they could actually make a lot more money if they left LG Tech and formed their own lead generation business. And so in early 2009, they did just that. They left LG Tech and they formed a new company called 800 Exchange. And right away, it took off, generating millions and millions of dollars in revenue, 80% of which was profit. During this incredible time, Chris used some of his money to buy a brand new Range Rover and a beautiful condo in Laguna Beach, and he fell in love with this beautiful ballet dancer named Erica. By and large, Chris seemed to be putting his roots down and really building a life for himself. As for Ed, despite his squeaky clean outward appearance as being this all-star family man and father, he was using his cash to party and gamble in Las Vegas. When Ed was at LG Tech, he would regularly go to Las Vegas to generate business, and while he was there, he developed a gambling addiction. When he and Chris formed 800 Exchange, Ed continued to go to Las Vegas to drum up business. It was something he was good at. But when he and Chris started making money hand over fist, his gambling addiction grew tenfold and he went completely off the rails. Ed was spending so much money in Las Vegas, sometimes up to 6 figures an hour, that one of the main casinos there would fly him in their private jet out to Las Vegas, and they would put him in their very best suite, fully comped. It's unclear how aware Chris was of Ed's crazy spending habits, because Chris rarely went to Las Vegas with Ed. The men were living their respective dreams until October of that year, when Ed was charged with embezzlement. Their former employer, LG Tech, had alleged that Ed had siphoned off about $2.5 million from their business to fund his wild Las Vegas lifestyle. Ed told Chris these allegations were totally false, but Chris was shaken. He was worried that if he didn't do something about this, Ed could potentially embezzle money from 800 Exchange. And so Chris went out and got a lawyer to begin protecting himself from his business partner. Over the following few months, Ed and Chris attempted to run 800 Exchange before Ed's trial date, but it was just too difficult because the trust had been totally destroyed by these allegations. And in May of 2010, Ed was convicted of felony embezzlement. In order to avoid jail time, Ed had taken a deal that meant he would need to pay roughly $800,000 of restitution to LG Tech. But Ed did not have $800,000. The only way he could make this payment would be if 800 Exchange, the business, fronted the money. But in order to do that, he would need Chris to sign off that he was okay with that because he owned half of the business. When Ed approached Chris, Chris said, "No, I'm not signing that. I'm worried you're going to take advantage of me too." But after a couple of weeks of talking to his lawyer, Chris finally told Ed that he was ready to meet up with him and come to some sort of agreement. And so on June 4th, the two men met up at the 800 Exchange office, and Chris decided to just sell his portion of the business to Ed for about $1 million, and then Ed can do whatever he needs to do with the business account to pay down his debts. Despite how crazy this situation was, Chris actually felt like this was kind of a win for him. He got a $1 million payday, and now he wanted to go out and celebrate. And so a couple of days after this meeting with Ed, Chris emails his family and says he's going to go on a 3-week vacation to South America and just go surfing the whole time. He's chartered this 45-foot yacht. He's hired a captain. He's hired a cook. It's going to be this dream vacation. He also regretted to inform them that he had broken it off with his girlfriend Erica, but he had a new girlfriend who'd be coming with him on this vacation, and she was a former Playboy playmate named Tiffany. His family was really surprised to hear the news about Erica because they really believed they were going to get married. But the trip itself was not really out of character. Chris had always said for the longest time that once he made it big and had millions of dollars in cash, he would just sail off into the Pacific and go surfing and just be off the grid and live his life in peace. And now he finally had a chance to do that. And so his family said, "Have fun, stay safe, and we'll see you when you get back." But 3 weeks went by and Chris did not return to his condo. Instead, he emailed his family again and just told them he was having this great time, that this was the best trip he could have asked for, and that instead of coming home, he was just going to keep sailing around the world and enjoying this time that he is disconnected from society. And again, his family said, "Okay, have a good time, stay safe, and we'll see you when we see you." But over the following weeks and months that Chris extended this vacation, his emails took a dark turn. Chris started to act depressed and he alluded to taking drugs, and then at one point he talked about doing the unthinkable, referencing harming himself. His parents were very concerned and told him he should come back home, or at the very least, they should arrange to meet up somewhere. But every time they said this, Chris would just suddenly change the tone of his email and seem really upbeat and cheerful and said, "Oh no, I'm actually just fine, and I just need some time to myself." Finally, in December of 2010, so 6 months after Chris has gone on this vacation, he reaches out to his brother Paul and asks him if he'll come to Costa Rica the following February to go surfing with him. Paul was excited and said he would go, and he and the rest of his family breathed a collective sigh of relief that now one of their family members would get to see Chris and actually check in on him. Shortly after this email exchange, Chris told his family that he was headed off into the Congo to sell some gold coins to a trader who was prepared to buy them at a 30% markup, and Chris was really excited about it. After this, there were no more emails. The family was concerned that this gold buyer potentially had kidnapped or hurt Chris, but Chris was going long periods of time between his emails to family, and so they figured, you know what, Paul's trip to Costa Rica where he's going to meet up with Chris is coming right up, so let's hold off doing anything drastic until then. But when February of 2011 rolled around and it was time for Paul to fly out to Costa Rica to meet up with Chris, before Paul left, he called the hotel in Costa Rica to confirm the reservations Chris had supposedly made. And the hotel said, "We've never heard of Chris Smith. There are no reservations under his name." And so Paul tried to contact Chris, but to no avail. And so Paul told his family about it, and they decided it was best for Paul not to go to Costa Rica because probably Chris wasn't there. And the family instead got in touch with the State Department and asked them if they could help them find their son, their brother. And right away, the State Department discovered Chris's passport had never left the United States. And his family said that was impossible because for the past year, Chris has been sailing around the world. But the State Department said, this is what we got. So Chris's dad, who used to be a cop, drove out to California to speak to Ed, who was the last person to see Chris before he left on this vacation. And Ed would say he has no idea where Chris is. However, he did say Chris had a fake passport, and that might be why his passport was not showing up as leaving the country. Chris's father didn't really know what to make of this information, and so he decided it would be best to just file a missing person report and put the investigation in the hands of the police. Shortly after the report was filed, the police brought Ed in for questioning, and Ed reiterated that he didn't know where Chris was and that he did have this fake passport, and he also said that they had not ended on good terms. They were kind of fighting and bickering at the end, and that's why he hadn't heard from Chris since he left. Ed was cooperative and didn't really have much to give police, and so the police let him go. While the police hit dead end after dead end in this missing person case, the property manager of the office building where the 800 Exchange business had been located was growing increasingly frustrated. Shortly after Chris had sold his portion of the business to Ed and then gone on this vacation, Ed had moved 800 Exchange from that office building to another, and Ed had not paid his final rent, which was $40,000. And this property manager had repeatedly tried to get in touch with Ed, but Ed was totally blowing him off. One day, the property manager was griping about Ed and his delinquent payment to another tenant in the office building, a guy by the name of Joe DeLue, who just happened to be a private investigator. And during this discussion, the manager was saying that not only had Ed not made this payment, but he had also been recently questioned by police about his missing business partner who was still missing. And so Joe is immediately intrigued by this, and he says to the manager, it sounds like Ed is a pretty shady guy. Would it be possible for me to just poke my head around their old space now that it's vacant? Because you never know, there could be something in there. And so the manager said that was fine. He opened the door to the old 800 Exchange space. Joe walked inside and immediately found blood spatter on the door frame of where Chris's office used to be. He also found blood spatter on the ceiling and on the walls. And so Joe called the police, who showed up and sprayed luminol all over Chris's office, and there was blood everywhere. It would turn out Chris didn't sell his portion of the business to Ed. On that day, June 4th, 2010, Chris did go into the office to try to reach some agreement with Ed, but when he walked in, Ed promptly killed him with a knife or some other blunt object. Then he, or someone he hired, dumped Chris's body somewhere. After that, Ed stole all of Chris's money to pay off the debt to LG Tech, as well as some other large debts in Las Vegas. And then after that, Ed hijacked Chris's email accounts and pretended to be Chris for almost an entire year. Chris never took a boating trip around the world. He never broke up with Erica and had this new girlfriend from Playboy. He just got killed inside of his office, and Ed created this ridiculous, elaborate lie that was designed to make his family believe that Chris had become unstable and that maybe he did end his own life, or maybe he did get kidnapped or killed in the Congo. Ed was just trying to create that seed of doubt that he had anything to do with it. But in 2018, it all came crashing down for Ed when a jury convicted him of killing Chris and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Ed maintains his innocence, and to this day, Ed still will not give up where Chris's body is.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Pier.
At around 5:20 p.m. on August 31st, 2007, a young couple stepped onto the beautiful sand of Yelpo Beach, which is located at the very southern tip of South Korea. The couple grabbed each other's hands and smiled in excitement as they looked out on the water and saw all these fishing boats that dotted the horizon, and then behind them were all these beautiful mountains. I mean, this was a spectacular place. They couldn't believe that a place so gorgeous and so remote was located only a 1-hour train ride away from the busy city where they went to college. The couple's names were Kim and Chu. Kim was 21 years old, and he was an athlete and a very dedicated student. And Chu, she was 20 years old and also very studious, but maybe unlike Kim, she was a bit more reserved and shy. In fact, Kim was Chu's very first serious boyfriend, and she absolutely adored him. And in fact, this was going to be the couple's kind of big first trip that they would take together. It was a Friday, and Kim and Chu planned to spend the entire weekend exploring this place called Yelpo Beach. Yelpo Beach is located right against this quaint little fishing village, and it's famous for its beautiful silver-colored sand. In fact, the beach is so famous, lots of people come out here and just camp out on the beach because it's just so beautiful. There's also a very busy open-air seafood market right nearby, which is really cool because all the fishermen come in and literally offload their catch right onto the table, and they sell it to people coming by. And also up in the mountains, you could see these beautiful bright green crops, which were tea plantations that made the air in Yelpo Beach kind of floral and sweet smelling. But before Kim and Chu began exploring all the kind of main tourist attractions, they wanted to go check out the fishing pier, which was not really a touristy attraction. It was just a regular fishing pier. But, Kim and Chu had been on this hour-long train ride and they wanted to stretch their legs, and the sun was starting to go down, and so they figured they could walk out on the pier, have a beautiful view of the water, and watch the sunset, and then after that, they could go kind of explore the main areas. And so Kim and Chu, still holding hands, began walking on the silver sandy beach in the direction of this fishing pier off in the distance. And as they were walking, Chu pulled out her camera and was taking all these pictures. But then at some point, Kim, who again is holding Chu's hand, he just abruptly stops and kind of squints his eyes and looks off in the distance towards the fishing pier. And Chu, she puts her camera down and asks Kim, what's going on? But Chu, without even saying anything to her, just raises his hand and points. And then seconds later, Kim and Chu were running down the beach. The next day, Chu was supposed to call her mother and check in about how the trip was going so far, but she never did. And so her mother eventually tried calling Chu later in the day, but it went straight to voicemail. And then also when Chu's mother called Kim, Kim was also not answering his phone. And so by the end of this day, when Kim and Chu's parents had not heard from their child, they did not wait for any more information. This was so uncharacteristic of Kim and Chu, who were always good about checking in and letting their family know what they were doing, that the parents, they just immediately went to the police and filed missing person reports. The police would launch an investigation very quickly, but they didn't have much to go on. All they knew was 2 adults were not answering their phone, but that was it. And so they started by trying to locate Kim and Chu's phones, but neither phone was giving off a signal, so they couldn't find them.
And so next, the police went to Yelpo Beach and began talking to people who were there on the day that Kim and Chu were to ask them if they had noticed anything funny, if they had seen the couple, did you notice them fighting? Were they talking to anyone unusual? Anything. But nobody remembered anything out of the ordinary, and the few people who had seen Kim and Chu on the day they were at Yelpo Beach, they said they seemed like a very happy, normal couple that were not fighting at all and were just enjoying their time in Yelpo Beach. And so over the course of that weekend, the police tried everything they could to try to locate Kim and Chu and figure out what happened, but they really made no progress whatsoever, and Kim and Chu never checked in by the end of that weekend. But everything would change on that Monday, September 3rd. On that day, a fisherman spotted a body floating in the water near Yelpo Beach, and it was Chu's body. And then 2 days after that, on September 5th, Kim's body washed up at a dock at a nearby fishing village. Both Kim and Chu were totally unrecognizable after being submerged in water for as long as they had been. Autopsies would show that Kim and Chu also had lots of bone fractures, but it wasn't clear if they were beaten by someone or something and that's what caused the fractures, or if they were just a product of being in the water for so long and smashing into rocks and boats and that kind of thing. But the police thought, this looks like there could be foul play involved. Maybe they were murdered. And so the police went back and began scouring all the footage from all the cameras at Yelpo Beach to see if maybe they could find some clip that would show what happened to this couple. And eventually, one of the detectives who was looking through all this footage found something really interesting. He found a very short clip of the couple over at that fishing pier that they had been walking towards. However, they were not up on the fishing pier like you would expect. They were below the fishing pier on the sand. And they were kind of standing next to each other, holding each other close, and there was nobody else around them. It was like this totally weird thing. Now, as weird as this was, because it made no sense for them to be below the fishing pier, there didn't appear to be any hazards or other people or anything near them. It was like they just chose to be under there for some reason. But regardless, the police would actually use this video clip to close the case. The police would say that, based on this clip, it appears that this was the final moment of the couple, underneath this pier, and then something happened. Either an accident, they might have fallen in the water or something and they drowned, or maybe, this couple elected to take their lives together. And while Kim and Chu's families vehemently disagreed with the police assessment, there was nothing they could do. The case was now closed. Nobody was trying to figure out what happened to Kim and Chu. That is, until 4 weeks later, on September 26th, 2007, when two more bodies, two young women, washed up on shore right around the same area where Kim and Chu had. The two young women had a lot of similarities to Kim and Chu. They were in their early 20s, they were tourists at Yelpo Beach, and their autopsies discovered that they had several bone fractures. And so this was enough for the police to launch a much bigger investigation into what was going on at Yelpo Beach, which included reopening the Kim and Chu case. And so a detective was assigned to go back through all the evidence in the Kim and Chu case and kind of re-examine it. And so this detective did look through all these pictures, and he would find one picture that broke the case wide open. Back on the night that Kim and Chu were at Yelpo Beach and they began walking towards the fishing pier, Kim had abruptly stopped and raised his finger and pointed at something, and then seconds later, he and Chu were running in that direction. Well, what Kim had spotted was a fisherman who was standing below the fishing pier, and he was very obviously making his way over to his fishing boat to go back out on the water. And Kim just felt like it would be really cool to go ask that fisherman if they could join him and go out on the water with him on his fishing boat to get a view of Yelpo Beach that way. And Chu, when she heard this idea, thought it was a great idea, and the two of them ran to the pier to try to catch this fisherman before he took off. And so that was why there was footage of the couple standing underneath the fishing pier. They were actually talking to this fisherman who could not be seen in frame. The fisherman was a 70-year-old man named Woo Jun Gwen, and he made his living selling octopus.
And at first, when Kim and Chu approached Woo and asked to go with him on his boat, he said, "No, I don't want you to come with me." But Kim and Chu seemed really desperate to go out with him, and finally he relented and said, "Okay, you can tag along." Woo was very thin and short, but he had been working on fishing boats since he was a child, and so despite his appearance of being this kind of small, frail guy, he was actually really physically strong. And despite Woo's kind of harmless-seeming exterior, inside, Woo was a very, very disturbed person. The reason Woo did not want to bring Kim and Chu with him out on this boat is he knew he would have an urge that he would not be able to control. But when they kept begging him over and over again to go with him, he finally just accepted that this was going to happen. He allowed them on his boat, he brought them out onto the water, and sure enough, he would act on those urges. Once Woo's boat was out on the water far away from the beach, he immediately pushed Kim overboard, and so Kim falls into the water, and then Woo grabbed this long metal grappling hook and began beating Kim in the water on his face, his arms, his hands, as Kim desperately tried to climb back in the boat. And eventually, Woo literally beat Kim to death. And at the same time, Chu is on this boat watching this happening. And so after her boyfriend has been beaten to death, Woo turns on Chu and does the same thing to her. He chucks her overboard and beats her until she dies from this grappling hook. And then afterward, Woo just got back behind the wheel, putted back to shore, and sold his octopus like nothing had happened. And Woo very likely would have gotten away with these first two murders, except 4 weeks later, it just so happened that two more tourists, those two young women, just happened to ask Woo the same question. "Can we go out with you on your boat?" And he would kill them the same way he killed Kim and Chu. Except one of those two young women, while they were out on the water in his boat before they were attacked, she sensed something was wrong, and she sent a text message saying she was in trouble on a boat. And when the police found these two women's bodies and found that text message, they immediately searched the registry that listed all the boats that had been out on the water near Yelpo Beach that day. And because it was a holiday, there was nobody out on the water except for one boat. And that boat was Woo's boat. And this is where that photo the detective found on Chu's camera roll, when finally somebody looked through the photos, that's where that photo comes into play. The last picture that Chu took is of Woo. Woo is right in front of her. He's piloting the boat out into the open ocean, and Chu just took a picture of him, not knowing what was actually happening. That this guy was driving her out to her death. Ultimately, Woo would be convicted of the murders, even though he didn't really offer up any clear explanation as to why he killed these people. He just kind of acted on these urges, so to speak, and he would be sentenced to death. And he would become the oldest death row inmate in South Korea.
Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also Mrballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious